Imagine waking up one morning to the sound of hundreds of boots stomping down the cobblestone street outside your window. There are no police sirens, no squad cars, no badge-wearing officers on their way to restore order. There is only the roar of a crowd, and it is growing louder. The year is 1747, and in the port city of Boston, something terrifying is happening. Ordinary people, sailors, shoemakers, dockworkers, merchants, have decided that they and they alone will be the law today. What happens next will shake the entire colonial world, and as shocking as it sounds, it is not an isolated moment. It is a pattern, a rhythm of life in a land where the rules of justice were written not in courtrooms, but in the streets. So ask yourself this: when there are no police, no prisons, and no system powerful enough to protect you, who decides what justice looks like? The answer, more often than you might expect, was the mob. To understand how crowds came to exercise such raw, unchecked power in colonial America, you first have to understand just how fragile and incomplete the systems of law and order truly were. When European settlers began building permanent communities along the Atlantic coast in the early 1600s, they brought with them English legal traditions: sheriffs, constables, night watchmen, and justices of the peace. These were the pillars of colonial law enforcement. But here is the uncomfortable truth: these systems were skeletal at best. Constables were typically appointed or elected by local communities, and they were part-time figures, often reluctant volunteers who had no formal training, no uniforms, no firearms issued to them by any authority, and no organized force backing them up. The first constable in America was appointed in Plymouth Colony in 1632, and even then, the role was so poorly defined and so lightly compensated that many men openly refused the appointment. Night watchmen in cities like Boston were little better, often described as groups of unreliable men, sometimes drunk, patrolling dark streets with lanterns and sticks. Beyond the coastal cities, in the vast backcountry stretching across the Carolinas, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York, formal law enforcement essentially ceased to exist altogether. There were no jails, no courts, no sheriffs riding to anyone's rescue. The nearest magistrate could be a full day's ride away, and even if you reached him, there was no guarantee he would or could act. Colonial America was, by any reasonable measure, a society operating without a functioning police force. In this vacuum, two things filled the void: informal community justice and something far more volatile: the organized fury of the mob. Scholars who have studied this period, including historians at Harvard and the Massachusetts Historical Society, have documented what they describe as a culture of crowd action, where community members genuinely believed that collective violence was not only acceptable but morally necessary when official channels failed. That belief had consequences that echo all the way to the present day. The story of the Knowles Riot of 1747 is one of the most vivid examples of how explosively mob justice could erupt when ordinary people felt they had been pushed too far. On the morning of November 16, 1747, Commodore Charles Knowles of the British Royal Navy ordered his press gangs into the streets and harbor of Boston. Impressment, the practice of seizing civilian men by force and conscripting them into naval service, was deeply hated throughout colonial America. It was, in the eyes of many colonists, little more than legalized kidnapping. That morning, Knowles's sailors grabbed dozens of Boston men, laborers, fishermen, ordinary tradespeople, simply trying to go about their day. They were dragged onto Royal Navy ships and told they now belonged to the Crown. The response from Boston was immediate and ferocious. Within hours, hundreds of sailors and working-class men armed themselves with cutlasses and clubs. They did not send a petition to the governor. They did not seek legal remedy. They seized naval officers directly off the streets, holding them hostage. They stormed the town house, forcing their way into the seat of colonial government. They surrounded the home of Governor William Shirley himself, pelting it with rocks and bricks, trapping him inside while they roared their demands in the street. For 3 straight days, the mob controlled Boston, not the constables, not the watchmen, the crowd. Governor Shirley eventually managed to negotiate a partial release of the impressed men, and only then did the violence slowly subside. But the message had been delivered with bone-rattling clarity. In Boston, when the British overstepped, the streets would answer. If the Knowles Riot showed what a mob could do when provoked by the Crown, The events of August 1765 showed what it could do when fueled by political rage. The British Parliament's passage of the Stamp Act, a direct tax on all printed materials in the colonies, triggered an explosion of crowd violence that still stands as one of the most dramatic episodes in American history. On August 14, 1765, the Sons of Liberty, led in part by the shoemaker Ebenezer Mackintosh, organized a mob that hung an effigy of Andrew Oliver, Boston's designated stamp distributor, from a great elm tree that would later be called the Liberty Tree. The effigy was paraded through the streets, stomped on, beheaded, and burned. The crowd then moved on to Oliver's office building and tore it apart board by board before descending on his private home, smashing every window and ransacking the interior. Oliver resigned his commission the very next morning, before a single stamp had ever been sold. But the August violence was not finished. 12 days later, on the night of August 26, 1765, the mob turned its attention to a far grander target. Thomas Hutchinson, the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, occupied what was widely considered one of the finest private homes in all of colonial Boston. The mob arrived after dark, and what followed was described by witnesses as something close to total destruction. Every stick of furniture was shattered or stolen. Pictures were ripped from the walls. Windows were reduced to splinters. The mob tore into the very walls of the structure, attacking the building's architecture as if trying to erase it from existence. They made off with silverware, wine, family documents, and cash. Hutchinson himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the night in his dressing gown as the crowd flooded through his doors. He later wrote, in words that carry unmistakable shock, that such ruins had never before been seen in America. And here is the part that makes this moment even more disturbing. Hutchinson had not actually supported the Stamp Act. He privately opposed it. It did not matter. To the crowd, his position, his association with British authority, was enough. The mob had appointed itself judge, jury, and executioner, and it had made its ruling without a single legal proceeding, without a shred of due process, and without any accountability whatsoever. While Boston's mobs were burning the homes of British officials, an entirely different but equally revealing form of mob justice was taking root nearly 1,000 miles to the south. In the backcountry of South Carolina, the years following the French and Indian War had produced a catastrophic collapse of social order. The war had scattered people from their farms and homes, and in its wake came waves of outlaw gangs, horse thieves, cattle rustlers, and violent criminal bands who terrorized the scattered rural settlements of the interior with near total impunity. There were no courts in the backcountry. There were no jails. The colonial government in Charleston was so remote, so indifferent, and so structurally incapable of reaching these communities that settlers had essentially been abandoned to fend for themselves. In 1767, as many as 5,000 backcountry settlers decided they had waited long enough. They organized themselves under the name the Regulators, and what they created was the first organized vigilante movement in American history. The Regulators did not ask for the law's permission. They hunted down criminal gangs, flogged thieves publicly and without trial, burned the homes of known outlaws, and in some documented cases, physically escorted entire families of suspected criminals to the edge of the territory and drove them out at gunpoint. They established their own courts, issued their own judgments, and carried out their own sentences. In 1768, when the colonial governor demanded they disband, they refused outright. The Regulators did eventually succeed in driving much of the organized criminal element out of the backcountry, and by 1769, a Circuit Court Act was passed that finally established official courts in the region, a direct result of the pressure the Regulators had applied. But the methods they used to get there were brutal, arbitrary, and frequently unjust. Men were punished on rumor and accusation. There was no appeal. Once the Regulators' judgment came down, it was final and it was physical. Then there is the story of John Malcolm, a man whose fate on a bitterly cold Boston night in January 1774 perfectly captures both the theater and the terror of colonial mob justice. Malcolm was a British customs official and a known loyalist, arrogant, combative, and widely despised in Boston. On January 25th, A Boston shoemaker named George Robert Twelves Hughes witnessed Malcolm threatening a young boy with a cane in the street over a trivial dispute. Hughes intervened, words were exchanged, and Malcolm struck Hughes on the head with that same cane. It was the spark the crowd had been waiting for. That night, a mob of several hundred Bostonians descended on Malcolm's house. They dragged him outside into the freezing night air, stripped him, and applied a thick coat of scalding hot tar across his entire body before rolling him in feathers. They loaded him into a cart and paraded him through the city streets for hours, forcing him to drink tea, a pointed political humiliation, until he was sick. They dragged him to the Liberty Tree and threatened to hang him. He survived the ordeal, though his health was severely damaged. The tar had burned his skin so deeply that it reportedly pulled flesh away when it was eventually removed. Malcolm later sailed to England, where he reportedly kept a jar of his own tarred flesh as a gruesome souvenir to show Parliament. The Boston press largely celebrated what had been done to him. To the crowd, it was justice. To anyone standing outside looking in, it was a torture session conducted by a mob in the streets of an American city, with no law to stop it and no consequence to follow. The consequences of all this crowd violence went far deeper than the physical destruction it left in its wake. What mob justice created in colonial America was something extraordinarily difficult to contain once it had been set in motion. A culture in which ordinary people came to believe that extra-legal force was a legitimate response to grievance. Historians have long noted that these crowd actions were not random. They followed patterns, had leaders, and operated according to their own rough internal logic. Scholars like historian Gary Nash have argued that colonial mobs were often expressions of genuine class tension, the poor and the working classes using the only form of power available to them to push back against elites and imperial authority. And in some cases, they worked. The Stamp Act was repealed. The South Carolina backcountry got its courts. The impressment of Bostonian sailors briefly ceased. In a world without formal democratic channels, the mob was sometimes the only instrument ordinary people had. But the cost was enormous. Innocent people were hurt. Property was destroyed indiscriminately. Reputations were ruined on the basis of rumor. Men like Thomas Hutchinson, flawed certainly, but not the villain the mob cast him as, were stripped of everything they had built by crowds that could not and would not be reasoned with. The terror this generated was not limited to loyalists or British officials. It ran through entire communities because anyone could become the crowd's next target if the political wind shifted. Fear was the currency of mob justice, and everyone paid it. What is striking, and perhaps unsettling, is how much of this history resonates with debates that are still very much alive today. The conversation about who controls public order, who gets to define justice, and what happens when official institutions fail or are perceived as corrupt. These are not ancient questions. They are the questions at the center of every major policing controversy of the modern era. When communities form neighborhood watch groups, when social media mobs descend on accused individuals before any trial takes place, when protesters tear down statues or attack property in the name of political grievance, the echoes of colonial crowd action are unmistakable. The South Carolina regulators were, in their own way, an early version of what modern criminologists call community self-policing, a community deciding that because the state has failed it, the community itself will impose order. The consequences then were the same as they tend to be now: initial effectiveness followed by dangerous overreach, with the most vulnerable people often paying the highest price. When we look at modern debates over police reform and the role of community-based alternatives to law enforcement, we are in many ways wrestling with the same fundamental question colonial Americans wrestled with. How do you build systems of justice that are both effective and fair, that protect people without also terrorizing them? The colonial experience offers a sobering answer. It tells us that when formal justice collapses, what rises in its place is not always wisdom. It is often the loudest, angriest voice in the street. There is something profoundly human about the impulse behind mob justice. When the law fails you, when authority ignores you, when the powerful seem untouchable, the desire to take matters into your own hands is as old as civilization itself. The men and women who filled the streets of colonial Boston, who organized the backcountry regulators, who paraded John Malcolm through the frozen January night, they were not monsters. They were people who lived in a world without adequate legal protection, who felt wronged and unheard, and who reached for the only tool available to them. But the tools we reach for in our most desperate moments are not always the ones that build something better. The history of mob justice in colonial America is ultimately a story about the difference between power and justice, because having the power to punish someone is not the same thing as being right about punishing them. That lesson cost a great many people enormously in the 1700s, and it is one we would be wise to carry with us. What do you think? Is there ever a moment when the crowd is justified in becoming the law? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this deep dive into colonial American history connected with you, be sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter in our exploration of America's most complicated and fascinating past. History, as always, has more to teach us than we realize.